Suicide for solenoid.
Words are hard.
It seems kind of important. It seems like, something you'd ask, am I getting value out of this toaster I have? Does it consume more electricity than the toast is worth?
So really, I mean, repeatedly, I said in the video that I don't know your arguments, and I wouldn't be addressing your arguments. But here you are laying out your arguments, so time to address them, I guess. This is a question of instrumental reason for you? Cost-benefit analysis? I mean, do you think that that's the appropriate way to handle the issue? I think that there are problems with that.
That's what a philosopher does. He talks about how it feels. He actually said that it feels wrong.
Yep. I like how you laugh at that as though I presented that as an argument. Meanwhile, though, I feel like you go on to make a lot of claims about how you feel.
The real question is what's in the benefit?
Nope. Reject that one out of hand.
So, yeah, it's a legitimate question.
Sure. Not the question that I was asking in the video, was it? I explicitly stated the question that I was asking in the video. That is, why would a person claim that having children is immoral? You go on to say, oh, well, we don't say that, and blah, blah, blah. Well, then I wasn't addressing you.
So the philosopher, I think, should do something like when he says that, he should say, wait a minute. Isn't the real question, when people have kids, should they have reasons or standards, to the performance level of this thing?
The implication, of course, being that human beings are perfectly rational, autonomous agents who make these kinds of decisions on the basis of reasons. Really? That's what you're going with? Because I don't think that's what human beings are. We are biological creatures who function on the grounds of drives. Any reasons that we might give for why we procreate are retroactive. They're after the fact. The procreative urge comes first, as I'm sure you will admit.
Maybe there should be some standards, and then maybe we should talk about what kind of tests you should have to pass.
Okay, how do you implement those standards without some kind of centralized power structures that infringe on the autonomy of human beings? That is, produce more suffering and produce coercion. It seems to me that in the very advocation of such a standards and practices goes against the very principles that you are arguing for. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can come up with some way to do it. I'd love to see it.
That should indicate that, wait a minute, there has to be more than you want.
Like what?
Alright, then he uses the typical. I mean, how many times have I said it's not about morality, it's about value?
Remember that time in the video that I said that I wasn't going to be responding to your arguments? Doesn't matter how many times you said it, because it wasn't about responding to your arguments. Question of whether or not it's about morality, it's a question of value, as you put it, assumes a systematic privileging of value, that is, instrumental considerations over moral considerations, that is, how we ought to act. Why? Seems to me to be innately backwards. Now, throughout the whole time, I was talking about values, what I value. But we'll get to that.
But they always got to say the words. Having children is immoral. So that's the question he's asking. He's saying anti-natalists are saying it's immoral to have children. God says so.
Didn't say that at all, actually. I said the antinatalist position, as I understand it, is saying this. And then I said I will go on to address that. Now, I can back it up in the history of antinatalist thought. You know your own history, yeah?
You're risking somebody else's welfare, which means that the amount of risk that's acceptable when you're risking somebody else's welfare is much higher.
Got it. But you're still conceiving of this in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. On what grounds? Why do you think that that's the most relevant way to evaluate the questions that you're putting forth? They are important questions, you're right. But why do you think that the question of exchange, the question of value as such, or in the sense that you're using it, economic value, really, why do you think that that is the most useful tool to address the question? Seems to me to be inappropriate, and I'd like some justification for that, please.
So yeah, and obviously we could say that, so couldn't somebody agree that it would be immoral to have children if you're doing it so you can molest them?
No, we wouldn't agree on that. Having a child in order to molest it, there is obviously something radically immoral in there, and that is the molestation of a child. It's not necessarily the having of a child. And I think the other immoral moment in that statement is conceiving of a child as an instrument. To think of a child as being something that you use for some purpose. To think of a child as a means to an end, right? I mean, molestation happens to be a pretty horrific end, but if you're going to use a child for Social Security, for instance, like you bring up later on in your video, I'd say that's immoral too. The only moral position, I think, properly, and it depends on which school of ethics you want to look at, but I think you can properly make the claim and defend the claim that the only moral way to consider the question is the child as an end in and of itself. This seems to be what you're having trouble with. And this is also why I'd totally reject your way of conceiving of a cost-benefit analysis here. Again, as a child is an end in itself. It is not a means to value or to returns.
Just like the ontological argument from religious kooks, it just feels wrong.
First of all, I don't know what the ontological argument is. Second of all, I didn't say that antinatalists are just like the religious kooks. I repeatedly said that I think that the position can be articulated in a way that has philosophical weight. At no point did I mean to say that, or to draw a comparison between the ontological argument and the antinatalist position. Clearly, if you rewatch the video, the comparison that I'm drawing is the comparison between the subjective experience of encountering the arguments, right? Nothing about the arguments in themselves, not saying anything about the people who advance the argument. It's not present in the video. You're reading that into it.
Yes, that's right. Okay, we can kind of understand psychologically. Of course it feels wrong because we've had 4 billion years of design pressure imposed on us.
You go on to rebut this as though I was presenting it as an argument. I don't know why. I mean, what I was trying to do was to explain. Somebody asked for my thoughts on the video, or not on a video, but on the position. I was trying to explain my thoughts on the position, right? I was trying to explain something about the subjectivity of the thing. That's very, very, very different than advancing an argument. Now, I do touch on a few arguments in that video which you get ghastly wrong, but we'll make those corrections as we come to them.
It doesn't like repeating other people's arguments. Well, I think it'd be great if you did, if you could find somebody else's argument and show it to me. I'd really love to see an actual argument that is something other than it just feels wrong.
Premise 1, particular beings act according to the necessity of their own ontology. Premise 2, human beings are particular beings. Conclusion 1, human beings unfold according to the nature of their own ontology. Premise 3, the ontology of the human emerges from a confluence of social, material, and evolutionary forces. Premise 4, the will to the propagation of genes is necessarily entailed in organisms that are formed through evolutionary processes. Conclusion 2, human beings at an ontological level have a natural drive to procreation, and as such, following from premise 1, will tend to act in accordance with said drive. Premise 5, ought implies can. Conclusion 3, it cannot be unethical for the human for the human species to propagate itself as, from conclusion 2 and premise 5, it's an inevitability. Now, I know that that's a question of whether or not it is moral or immoral for the human species to propagate itself. But I think that's what matters, because morality is the question of how should I act. Now, when you ask this question of value, I asked you before what makes you think that this kind of instrumental reasoning is sufficient or interesting or the right toolkit to use to investigate this problem. Because it doesn't seem to matter to me all that much whether or not kids are valuable, right? Whether or not human life or life as such is valuable. It seems to me that your standard of value is arbitrary as well, as all standards of value are. They are intersubjectively arrived at. That's what value is. So the fact of the matter is that the human species, again, intersubjectively, deems that it is of value to continue to propagate our species. So therefore it has value.
An argument that defends the right of people to play God with somebody else's welfare when they have no God powers.
This is such a strange question. I mean, do you think that the justification for God being able to bring things... I'm an atheist, I'm not a Christian, but do you think that within any religious framework, the reason why God has the right to create is because he has superpowers? Or powers, as you put it. I mean, that's not what it is. If I had quote-unquote God powers, whatever fuck that is, heat vision maybe. If I had God powers, I don't think that that would necessarily give me the right to quote-unquote play God. But see, this is where you're moving into an area of equivocation. You're starting to talk about rights. Well, what are rights? Rights are a definition of human autonomy. Are they not? I have the right to do X, Y, and Z. If you tell me I can't do those things, that is to infringe on my autonomy. What is autonomy? Autonomy is a moral value. So when you're talking about rights, you're talking about a moral question. But you just talked about how you're not talking about a moral question. I don't see how I don't see how you're not contradicting yourself. Thought it was just about value in an economic exchange sense. Turns out it's about autonomy, rights, morals.
Okay, so then he's gonna start telling us what our argument is.
Wait, telling quote unquote us what our argument is? Are you not in that category? Because I do remember saying I will not be addressing any of Amendham's arguments.
So he paraphrases us by saying,
nope, not paraphrasing you. Again.
The argument from human suffering. Well, first off, it's not the argument I've made. My argument would be the argument from suffering, period.
Interesting. So you're trying to bring animals into this. Maybe moral, maybe not. I'm going to say it's moral, but then use moral categories and moral reasoning and moral language to talk about the thing. But if you say I'm talking about morality, you're going to get it, brother. Whatever this thing is, right, to talk about animals. Fact of the matter is that I don't think we ascribe moral judgments to animals' actions. So if rabbits propagate their own species, is that not moral? I guess it's not even just not moral, it's without value. I don't know what the fuck you're saying anymore.
But more rationally, the argument is too much suffering. The argument from it's too expensive. So let's just say suffering is another word for expense.
That seems arbitrary. Suffering is expense. Suffering is something that you pay. Something that you pay to who? Something that you buy and sell in the market. It has some value, not just some value, but some fixed value. I mean, this seems to not go hand in hand with the idea of expense. there's nothing about suffering that seems to lend itself to that analogy. It seems just as arbitrary as saying, well, let's say suffering is potato.
The worst horror consumes almost an infinite amount of your grand pleasures. I can think of one person dying of radiation sickness after we dropped the nukes in Japan, and I can say, what have I accomplished, or you, or any of these fucktards around me? How many of these fucked-hearted, stupid existences, Batman existences, are worth that horrible death?
Ooh, that's a great question. So let's do the math. How do you measure suffering? According to what units? How do you measure pleasure? Are they on the same scale? Are they convertible into one another? How do you do that measurement? Because I have no idea. I mean, it sounds reasonable, right? But at the same time, how is this not arbitrary nonsense that you've just assigned out of nowhere? Like, where is your justification for that? Waiting.
Imposed in that horrible way. First you watch your wife and kids die, and then you slowly die vomiting to death.
Appeal to emotion? Anyone? Anyone?
I can't think of anything you are ever going to do that's going to be worth that. Can you? You want to tell me?
Sure. Again, give me some standard by which we can agree upon how to evaluate this question, even possibly how to communicate information to one another other than I feel, which like 2 minutes ago you were so derisive about. I mean, and you're presenting this as an argument, right? So yeah, provide me with some kind of metric, and we can begin to talk about the calculus of pleasures and pains. I don't think it exists, though, and if it doesn't, you got nothing.
But yeah, I'd like you to deal with the argument from silly addiction. Okay, so that would be one if you're taking suggestions. Explain how everything you do isn't just some sort of addictive psychology, and it really doesn't matter what makes you happy.
Didn't say that it mattered what made me happy. Wasn't the point of anything that I said, and if you read that into my video, I apologize for your misunderstanding. But in the meantime, how is everything that I do not just some kind of silly addiction? Well, if you want to call everything that I do some kind of silly addiction, then I value silly addictions. In fact, I'm going to go smoke a cigarette. That's a great idea. No, I don't, this is rhetoric. There's no substantive claim in here. I mean, you can call it silly addictions. This is like, how is your mother not a whore? Well, because she doesn't sell her body on the street for money. There's a definition of addiction, right? Necessities, ontological necessities of the human being are excluded from that category by definition. This is just basic linguistics.
It's all the same kind of wank. And do you really think your wanks are worth it?
So you're making quantitative judgments without any standard metric, again. So I can just say, yeah, my wanks are totally worth it. Gotta love those silly addictions.
And then the argument from frivolous function, that everything we do is pretty much for the frivolous purpose of replicating a molecule.
Everything that we do is in service of this quote-unquote frivolous purpose. In what sense is it frivolous? I mean, frivolity, of course, is a judgment that a human subject places on something, is it not? Places on something that has no meaning to that. But if this thing is the driving force behind everything that we do, including ascribing meanings to things, etc. I mean, I find meaning in sexuality. People find meaning in playing with their kids, right? So, if everything is for the purpose of replicating this molecule, quote unquote, in what sense is it frivolous? It seems to be a contradictory statement.
How come that argument doesn't make you feel something?
It's not about my feelings. I didn't evaluate any argument on the basis of how I feel. I didn't propose any statement on the basis of how I feel. Again, misreading.
Survival for the sake of survival. Perpetuation for the sake of perpetuation. How come you don't feel something about that? Like, somehow that doesn't sound quite right.
It doesn't sound right, actually. And the reason why it doesn't sound right is quite simple. Survival and perpetuation are not means. So we don't survive for the sake of survival. We do other things as means to the end of survival. Survival is an end in itself. Perpetuation is an end in itself. You're confusing ends and means.
Anyway. Yes, I'm being a bit mocking because this is just so glib. Like I said, the most important question I think the human race could possibly ask itself is, are we doing good enough?
I thought the most important question was, what is the value of the human endeavor, or human life, or however you phrased it? Because those aren't the same question. Are we doing good enough? No, we're not doing good enough. Probably isn't such a thing as doing good enough. I'm perfectly prepared to concede that. It is immaterial to the point.
How are we doing? And if you're going to answer we're doing just fine, or we're doing good enough, or that we have done good enough ever, I think you're full of shit.
I would think I was full of shit too, actually. But please cite me the precise timestamp on my video where I said anything like we're doing good enough, or we have done good enough, or just anything like it. Specific timestamp, please.
And there's very little prospect it's going to get better.
I don't know what standard you measure that by, but I'm just prepared to agree with that. It's probably all downhill from here. It's an appeal to consequence, though, isn't it?
So he starts talking about Schopenhauer, which is kind of useless. He is dead, you know.
You heard it here first, folks. The ideas of dead people are useless.
Crap argument. Yeah, well, this idea that utilitarians have this notion. So he agrees that reducing harm or suffering is good. So it's good to reduce suffering. But that isn't really a good, because that's not an affirmative good.
I didn't say it wasn't a good on the grounds that it wasn't an affirmative good. It's devoid of content because it's a negation. There's no affirmation present in it.
You see, so preventing harm, that's not of any real value.
Again, please point me to the timestamp.
Maximize good stuff and just don't worry about the bad stuff.
Don't worry about the bad stuff? Where are you getting this from? It's not in the video that I put up.
And it'll all work out, because love cures cancer.
It's not a matter of whether or not it all works out, first of all. Second of all, I don't think it will all work out. All signs point to no.
So you can't do something like I said, preventing a harm.
I feel like a broken record, but timestamp, please.
Is a negative way of thinking. That's a negative way of thinking.
Yes, someone in my comments section misunderstood this one as well. When I say negative, I don't mean you should be positive or you're being negative. That's not the point, right? If I say there is not a chair in my room, that is a negative statement. There is not something, right? If I say there is a chair in my room, I am affirming something. That is an affirmative statement. It has nothing to do with being positive or you're being negative. It has nothing to do with that, right?
And so, yes, ethics should start with an affirmation. Drinking is fun. Yeah, okay, that's affirmative. Driving is fun. That's affirmative. So let's drive and drink.
So you're suggesting that the statement ethics should begin with an affirmation is identical to the statement the contents of the ethical is made up of all affirmations and every possible synthesis between them. I mean, if anything, ethics is a heuristic for distinguishing affirmations that are valuable and affirmations that are not valuable. It's just simply not a question, right? Clearly there is non-parenting here.
So anyway, it's a typical thing. So he's going to tell me what he values. So of course I'm supposed to value what he values.
Yes, I told you what I value. Things that I value. Please show me the timestamp where I say that you should value the same thing. I mean, it's a total non sequitur.
Anyway, so he thinks love and honesty and kinship and whatever will save the day. So if we all invest in love, honesty, kinship, and whatever, everything will be fine.
Didn't say that everything will be fine if we invest in these things. Wasn't advocating love, honesty, kinship, etc. I wasn't advocating those things. I said here are examples of positive values. And I don't see how and the fact is that you are elevating the reduction or eliminating of suffering to a point of privilege above every single one of those values. That seems to me to be arbitrary. Didn't say, at no point did I say that anything is going to work out fine. No point did I say that you should believe that. At no point did I say, hey, we should get on this bandwagon together, man.
And there's so much evidence that we are so full of love.
Didn't say that there was any amount of evidence that's saying that we are full of love rather than bigotry, or you go on to give a few examples. Didn't say that at all. In fact, it would be a naturalistic fallacy to say that. It's the is-ought problem, right? It's not the case that we are or are not filled with love, or however you put it, and therefore we ought to be filled with them. No, if anything, it is that we are not filled with such things that we should strive to be filled with them. I mean, it has no bearing, naturalistic fallacy, to say X is how something is. It does not follow that has any bearing on X is how something ought to be.
And so he thinks that's the way we're all born.
Timestamp, please.
You people don't want to swim for turds? Fuck you. You're going to do it anyway, because I say so.
Where does it follow from the statement that I am not an antinatalist that I think that you must have children? Fuck you. You have to do it anyway. Doesn't follow from that. Just because I don't find the arguments persuasive doesn't mean that I'm arguing to coerce you into doing anything.
Right, so the way to make a good nuclear power plant is just to be really aggressive and go all the way, and don't mess with that risk-averse stuff.
Really? Where are you getting this from?
I mean, you're calling honesty an attribute?
Honesty is an attribute.
Is all the cancer, all the nursing home shit, all the horrible, horrible, horrible horrors that happen to people, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, it's this love thing. Yeah, trust me, it's worth it.
No, I said that I'm not convinced that human suffering is sufficient grounds to produce a world wherein which nothing that I value, or you value for that matter, is present. I mean, the definition of value is something that you want to propagate, something that you want to spread in the world. So, or at least that's part of the definition. So I don't know where you're getting that.
So it's a matter of scales, and that one always gets you in trouble because then he's basically just saying, I think it's worth it.
No, I didn't say that it's a matter of scales and I think it's worth it. I said that the antinatalist wager was that it is a matter of scales, and the conclusion is that you don't think it's worth it. And the fact of the matter is that I can think of at least 5 times in this video so far where you have explicitly said that it's a matter of value, it's a matter of returns, it's a matter of consequences, it's scales. You proceeded to go on and argue, no, it's not worth it, putting it on scales again. And then you say, well, you know, talking about scales is just arbitrary. I wasn't talking about scales. I was saying that the antinatalist wager is predicated on a certain kind of calculus, a certain kind of weighing out of things, which you've done for the whole video.
Well, I wrote down the unneeded need is not unneeded. That's sort of his argument, that we somehow need to need our love and our value.
That's not what I said at all. I was arguing against, remember that whole scale thing that you said that I was doing? I was arguing against that scale thing. And I was framing it from the perspective of utilitarian reasoning, that again, ethics is a calculus. Ethics is a matter of putting things on scales and weighing out the positives and negatives, cost-benefit analysis, again, what you have been doing for the whole video. And I was criticizing that. And I was criticizing specifically the classical utilitarian perspective, that it's about the pursuit of happiness and the reduction of suffering. And pointing out that I don't think that human beings want to be happy. I think that we're self-destructive. Do you disagree?
And if we're not here to need love and value, love and honesty, then there won't be anything here to miss it either. But somehow it'll be missed.
Timestamp, please. Specifically where I said it would be missed.
Circularity.
Yep, that's why I didn't make that argument.
There's a simple question, right? Is the universe substantially diminished because the Martians aren't here loving and telling the truth?
Are you asking me if I think that the universe would be better if there were Martians doing things that complex organisms do, participate in social configurations, communication, for instance? It's an interesting question. I think that the universe probably would be better if there were more things that I value in it. At least I would find it to be. Wouldn't you?
How much time, why don't you tell me how many minutes, how many milliseconds of your life you've actually spent contemplating the non-existent Saturnites and lamenting the fact that they're not loving and telling the truth?
If there were, at some point, historically, Saturnites who were honest, loving beings, and they all decided to end their own existence, I would find that terribly sad.
Oh, the humanities.
Wouldn't it be the Saturnity?
The constellation of value. So now it's a constellation. And this philosophy, right, he lives in the world where there's a constellation of value.
Criticizing words you don't know what they mean?
And it's reductio absurdum.
Reductio ad absurdum. You don't know what that means either, do you?
Choosing fail-safe is absurd.
Timestamp, please.
Conclusion. That's what he called it. He called it an absurd conclusion. And then said, I'm not dismissing it out of hand.
Let's go to the videotape, which you play right after this, which is not what I said.
Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard specifically that do affirm that. So I don't want to dismiss out of hand or make fun of someone who's an antinatalist or something like that.
I'll just say that their conclusion is that absurd.
Those aren't contradictory. There's a difference between antinatalism and antinatalists. I could say that all sorts of isms are ridiculous. It doesn't mean that I want to shit on every person who affirms the various isms that I disagree with or that I think are absurd. They're not mutually exclusive statements.
Yeah, they'll like that much better. Schopenhauer would he would love for you to say his conclusion is absurd. He'd find that, oh yeah, thank you. What a compliment. Appreciate it.
The argument is not identical to the man. This is why the ad hominem fallacy is a fallacy. If the argument were identical to the man, then the ad hominem fallacy would not be a fallacy. Fact of the matter is, I'm willing to criticize a conclusion, and I don't really care whether or not it hurts somebody's feelings. That doesn't mean that I'm going to run around saying that antinatalists are idiots. And I said that it is a position that has some philosophical weight. I said that I, in the first person, find the conclusion to be absurd. Those are radically different statements. I have good friends who believe things that I regard to be absurd. I think we all probably do.
It can be articulated with some weight, yet I don't pay any attention to that because, fuck it, who cares?
I didn't say fuck it, who cares? It's not the point at all. So that I don't buy it. Right? Just because something has a tradition behind it, which is what I mean when I say it can be articulated with some weight. It can be argued, right? Just because a thing can be argued doesn't mean that I'm under any obligation to buy it or find it persuasive. Christianity can be argued. Christianity can be articulated with some weight. Doesn't mean that I have to be a Christian. Doesn't mean that I believe it, right?
If you don't get a gooey feeling for it, then there's no point in talking about it. So if I don't take all legislation and all theoretical science and put little ribbons on it so you can get emotional about it, there's no point in talking about it.
I am currently talking about
it. Wow. Ooh. Phew. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, no profound bells are ringing.
Are you saying it doesn't give you a gooey feeling inside and therefore we shouldn't talk about it?
It's a fair cop kind of description if you have to pigeonhole us.
Again, at no point in the video that you're talking about did I say a single thing about anything that you thought, and in fact explicitly said that I wasn't going to be talking about anything that you thought.
Even though we never asked you to do that, thank you very much. But if you have to do it, that certainly would be the rational terminology. But antinatalists believe in a will to be happy?
Didn't say that I believe that antinatalists believe in a will to be happy. So that the antinatalist arguments that I've seen, including the ones that you've advanced right now, actually, suffering is bad, it should be avoided, and there is a calculus by which we can talk about the reduction of suffering. And the willful choice to stop reproducing is a way to totally end suffering, right? Is that a wrong paraphrase of what you said, of what you have been saying so far? That emerges from within a utilitarian framework. So when I say the utilitarians in a certain form, I believe I say, the utilitarians in a certain form, or the classical utilitarians, claim that we want to be happy and we want to reduce suffering. And then I problematize the issue of happiness. The point is to problematize the classical utilitarian frame through which one might arrive at the kinds of conclusions that you are getting at. Didn't say that you're using that frame. In fact, I explicitly said, again, that I wasn't going to be addressing any of your arguments.
He considers antinatalism a rash conclusion because, there's obviously so much that the human race has demonstrated its magnificence. It's right on the brink of being so fucking brilliant.
Whether or not, I think I used the word radical, but you might be right, I might have used the word rash, whether or not the human race is brilliant does not make antinatalism not a rash claim. Pardon the double negative. It doesn't seem to me that they have any connection whatsoever.
We're right on the edge. It's a rash conclusion to say it isn't working.
It's not a rash conclusion to say it isn't working. In fact, I affirm that. That's true. It isn't working. So what? The rash conclusion is that the solution to that problem is therefore to die out as a species.
Yeah, I mean, come on, get serious. How can you coerce it? It's a goddamn blob. No, you're imposing it. It's an imposition. It isn't a fucking coercion. You're not making a deal.
All right, how can you impose something on it? I mean, it's a goddamn blob, as you put it. The issues that I'm bringing up with the notion of coercion also work with the word imposition, right? I don't know if you've noticed, but coercion isn't about making deals. It's about the exact opposite of that.
You're physically building it and shoving it into the world.
And the problem is that in all, I mean, I said this about coercion, you could say it about imposition, right? In all cases where I would use the word imposition, I impose X on someone or something. That thing already has to exist. It has to already be in the world. So I don't know what it means to impose something on a non-person. The change in word doesn't affect anything here.
Procreation will create adult organisms.
Yep, infant mortality rate is 0.
Their pressure you're placing on something that's going to change their destiny. So it's a coercion of... And again, you can't get more in somebody's face than to make their face.
Right, so again, the point is you have to use this language that you change something's destiny by force. If there is no destiny beforehand, it doesn't make sense to talk about changing something's destiny. The fact of the matter is that giving birth to something is a very particular case. And I think that the language breaks down when you begin to talk about imposing things onto non-entities, or coercing non-entities into existence, however you want to phrase it.
At the very least, the pregnancy.
Right. And we have no clue what's going to happen. The baby probably is just going to be a cup of water.
I didn't say that we didn't have any clue what was going to happen to the baby. In fact, the entire time, I didn't argue from consequences. Why? Because I'm not a consequentialist. Haven't argued from consequences in this video. Didn't argue from consequences in the last video. In fact, if you can find me one example of me arguing from consequences, please give me the timestamp.
You're just like, why the fuck am I talking to people this fucking stupid? You shouldn't even be allowed to say the word Schopenhauer and then pretend you don't know that babies turn into human beings.
When did I say that I don't know that babies turn into human beings? Timestamp, please. I mean, you're staring at the video. Just what timestamp is that? Because it's not in there anywhere.
Oh yeah, the ontology thing, epistemology thing, whatever crap.
Words are hard.
It's a very complex amount of stuff happening. So because there's a lot of stuff between turning the key and the car running, you're going to say you can't see the connection? Or you can only see connections that are very quick in time?
Didn't say anything like that. Again, timestamp, please.
He's one of these value relativist assholes. He thinks people just make up value. There's no such thing as child molesting being bad, and there's no such thing as harm being a bad thing, because sometimes harm is perfectly good because you make lots of money off of it. So if you can torture one slave and make 100 people really happy by torturing him, it's a deal, man, no problem.
There is not one point in here where I talked about relativism, or I implied relativism, or anything like that. The fact of the matter, though, isn't like 20 minutes ago when I said, I value things like love and compassion and kinship, whatever, anything else that I value. Didn't you say, like, oh, you value that, and you're expecting all of us to value that? How are you not a relativist, or at least in that moment, are you not contradicting what you're saying right now? Fact of the matter is that you're relativizing certain values when you find it convenient, and you're not relativizing other values when you do find it convenient. So I'd like you to sketch out some kind of heuristic for telling us what kind of values you feel like are arbitrary for other people to espouse versus the values that you espouse, which are not relativistic, seems to be a totally, again, arbitrary judgment. And one more thing, didn't you say that you meant the word value at the beginning of the video, that you meant the word value in an amoral sense? What is the value of this thing? What is the exchange of this thing? What is the cost-benefit analysis in relation to this thing? Because the concept of values within the context of a moral framework is radically different than the context of values within the framework of an economic system. So this is an equivocation. And again, you're back to this moment of, no, don't call this a moral argument. But I'm going to use all these moral terms in their moral senses when it's convenient,